Hey everyone, Michael Unger here with another edition of Ask an Astronomer here on very snowy conditions here on unceded territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And just a couple doors down from me is our astronomer also preparing to go out into this wild weather we have here, and that is Marley. Hey Marley, how's it going?
It's good. At least it's not -30. I'll always say that.
Yeah, so this is kind of like home. Like you've got this, right?
I mean, I have this. I don't know if the rest of the city has this.
Okay.
Yeah, we need more
Uh,
snowplows, but yeah, whatever. What do I know?
Exactly. We've got an event tonight as well, so could be interesting times. But we've got a special show for you today, our first Ask an Astronomer of 2024. And just a few days ago, we've got some news about a mission that we have been talking about a lot, and we will be talking about more for probably the next several years. But there's a very important mission that we have been talking about, and that is the Artemis mission, the Artemis Accord that CSA, Canadian Space Agency, has partnered with, which is why we talk about it a lot. But we had some big news, so that is going to be the theme for today's show. If you are out there watching on YouTube, on Facebook, even on Instagram, you can pop a comment in or a question about anything under the universe, even if it is about Artemis or not. We will answer all of before we get to the half-hour mark today. So welcome to everyone. Now, Marley, like I said, we're talking about Artemis. What is happening?
Well, I'll give you one guess as to what's happening. The word that has plagued this mission since its inception, of course, delays. So we have some more delays, which, if you are kind of in the loop, like a lot of the people that work here, is not surprising to any of us. This is a very complicated mission. There's a lot of new technology being tested, which means we want to get it right the first time, especially once people begin to become involved, right? So the announcement on January 9th came as a media teleconference. It wasn't anything super fancy, which they tend to do for when they announce delays. It's usually a bit quieter. But they did announce that Artemis 2, instead of going ahead November 2024, November of this year, has been pushed back until September of next year, which means Artemis 3, Artemis 3 is being pushed back from December of 2025 to September of 2026. So both missions are delayed a year. Honestly, will probably be delayed again before this. In the press briefing themselves, they said that even with the delays for Artemis 3, it's a very aggressive timeline, and it counts on everything going right the first time and absolutely no problems arising, which, as we saw with the launch of Artemis 1, the numerous launch attempts with Artemis 1 is not always the case. But what is interesting is what exactly is causing the delay, because it came from something that I didn't quite expect to be the problem, as well as there's more than one reason for the delay. Instead of just one big problem, there's a couple problems. Yeah, which, I don't know, it was kind of interesting. So in the press conference, there were a variety of reasons, but it all hinges on the fact that every next Artemis mission, so every subsequent Artemis mission, depends upon the mission that happens before it. So Artemis 2 depends upon Artemis 1, and Artemis 3 depends on Artemis 2, because they have tried to build into this program a more sustainable way of doing space exploration. So pieces from Artemis 1 are actually being used in Artemis 2. These non-core avionics systems, so like flight and guidance electronics, are being reused in Artemis 2. I thought that if there were going to be problems, that's where the problems would arise from. But it's actually not where we're seeing the problems. We're actually seeing the problems in different places. So I'm going to start with the delays for Artemis 2 and then go into Artemis 3 first. So this is the Artemis 2 crew looking at their capsule that they will not be in for another long while, unfortunately. No.
Oh, they're just like longingly looking at it.
Yeah, that's their capsule for Artemis 2. So the non-avionic components of Artemis 1, so guidance, navigation, control, radio communications antennas, and transponders, have already been installed into the Orion capsule for Artemis 2. The video processing unit has probably also been reused. Not being used from Artemis 1 to Artemis 2 are things like displays and controls, things that the astronauts will directly touch and use, and the environmental control and life support systems. Those are all new to Artemis 2. They are not being reused. The idea, is that with each progressive mission, the amount of materials being reused will increase, eventually even going as so far as reusing the heat shield from capsule to capsule, which is very interesting to me. I'm not entirely sure how well that'll work, but that's their intended goal to do so. So one of the first big problems has to do with that heat shield. Now, the heat shield for Artemis 1 is not being reused. It's kind of like their test heat shield. But I wanted to try to show exactly the temperatures that this capsule has gone through after reentry. So this is the capsule in space, still attached to the European service module. It's very nice and shiny. And this is the capsule after reentry. So it is charred. You know, these two windows are the two windows on this side here. Where's my little laser pointer? These are these two windows. You can see the NASA and the American flag. Gone. You can kind of see where the American flag was. And then these are these two windows, and these are the other two on the other side. It gets very, very scorched upon reentry. Now, this capsule reaches temperatures of about just under 3,000 degrees Celsius as it comes in. This is what it looks like before it's all, you know, pretty eyes and covered and stuff. It's all actually a bunch of separate panels holding it together. And the heat shield is covered in a material called Avcoat, and it's an ablator. What that means is that it burns off during reentry. It's designed to burn away, which takes the heat away from the spacecraft. So the front of the heat shield, like the part that directly hits the atmosphere first, reaches just under 3,000 degrees Celsius, but the backside, the side that the floor of the capsule is, only reaches about 93 degrees Celsius. So quite a heat differential, and it's designed that way to protect the people inside. Makes a lot of sense. The rest of Orion also has like a different ablator material that's made of like woven threads of quartz in a resin that's a bit stronger. They were testing that for the first time as well, and that ended up working fine. The problem happened with the heat shield. So this is the heat shield before it was installed on the Orion capsule. This is the heat shield from just the flight test. So just the flight test. This wasn't even the big Orion launch, Artemis launch. This was just the flight test from 2012. And this was the result after only experiencing temperatures of about 2,200 degrees Celsius. So quite damaged, quite scorched. Over this flight test in 2014, about 20% of the Avcoat was eroded or ablated away, which is what they wanted. You can kind of start to see the orange peeking through. That's like, say, similar to the orange from this example. It's like layers upon layers. For this flight test, at its thickest, the heat shield was 1.6 inches or 4 centimeters thick. After this, they increased the thickness of the heat shield. They vary now from 1 inch to 3 inches thick in some areas, depending on where exactly the most of the heat hits when the capsule first re-enters the atmosphere. And so during the reentry of Orion on Artemis 1, some of the material ablated differently than what they expected because they do a bunch of computer modeling and ground tests, and it came back slightly different. There's still a good amount of this orange stuff left over, like that's untouched, hasn't been hit by the atmosphere, hasn't been burned away, but it's in different areas than they expected, and it's of different amounts than they expected. It means they had to really look into what was causing the problem. Why did it ablate differently? And could that pose a risk to future missions? And is there a way that we can fix that and prevent it from happening? So this is the Orion capsule from Artemis 1. These are a bunch of different engineers and scientists and a football fan taking a look at what's going on underneath the heat shield there. In November so it came out in March 2023 that this heat shield had ablated differently than they wanted it to, is when it was first announced. In November of 2023, they were still studying the performance of the heat shield and looking at factors that could have caused the extra loss of material. And they were kind of looking at the skip re-entry maneuver. So typically when we think of things entering the atmosphere, they just hit and they burn up immediately. They do it in one shot. The Orion capsule instead for Artemis does this new type of entry, skip re-entry, where it hits the atmosphere, kind of skims it, skips off, and then dives into the atmosphere. And this was done for like energy saving reasons and other stuff. So they thought perhaps it was that skip re-entry maneuver, that skip re-entry trajectory that had caused some of this excess ablation of the material. They've been able to mimic the problem on ground tests so far, but they're still not entirely confident that that's what's caused the issue. And they're hoping to have a root cause of the problem by springtime this year. So this is part of the reason why this mission has been pushed back. Unfortunately, the heat shield of Orion for Artemis 2 has already been installed. So now we run into a bit of a problem. So the NASA Deputy Associate Administrator for the Moon to Mars program, Amit Kshatriya, he said that the teams are making really good progress on identifying the root cause. Like they're getting really, really close to the answer, but more time is needed to understand the data and to also remodel, right? To see exactly what type of flight trajectory they need and, to find out the new parameters for what they can and cannot do, their margins of error. Depending on what that data says, the solution could lead up to and include replacing and creating an entirely new heat shield for Artemis 2, which would mean that the heat shield currently installed on the Orion capsule would need to come off, a new one developed, a new one attached, and then everything would have to be tested all over again, which would further delay or possibly cause further delays. So that is kind of the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems to watch in terms of when this mission will actually go. The September 2025 timeline feels very far away, but that's actually quite close in terms of if you have to create an entire new heat shield, as well as re-look at the launch abort system, which is problem number 2 with what they have found. So the launch abort system is this interesting, it's like the very tip top of the rocket. When you look at the SLS, the very top, it attaches to the top of the Orion capsule. And it's designed to carry the crew to safety in the event of an emergency during launch or ascent. So if something happens to the rocket and they need to abort launch, this top part is attached to the Orion capsule and it shoots off and it carries it away from the rocket. The rocket goes on, and then usually the idea is that it's detonated. They have the abort system on the rocket that will cause it to explode. But this pulls them away from safety. It's got 3 solid rocket motors to pull Orion away. And if everything goes well, it has this jettison motor. So if they don't need to abort, this jettison motor will turn on and this whole thing will separate so that Orion can continue on into space. The problem here is that in some cases where the abort system would be triggered, there were deficiencies in the electrical system, quote unquote, meaning that the launch abort system would be able to separate with Orion, which is what we want it to do, but it might not have been able to maintain all power necessary from separation all the way until their landing in the ocean, which is bad because we want Orion to still have power, to still be able to conduct itself, to still go through all of the emergency launch procedures it needs to do. And the assessment of this is still in its early stages. So we don't quite know what the fix is or what exactly the problem is, only that there is a problem with the electrical wiring in this case. The third problem has to do more with electronics. So again, this is the Orion 2 or Artemis 2's Orion capsule. I keep wanting to call it Orion 2. That's not its name. It's still just Orion. What is wrong with this is that they actually were looking at Artemis 3. So they're already starting to build the capsule for Artemis 3. The hardware delivered for Artemis 3 found failures in the circuitry that would control aspects of the life support system on the spacecraft, which is very, very important if you are moving people to and from Earth and the moon. One of the systems in particular is the system that would remove carbon dioxide from the capsule. So they made the decision, NASA made the decision that even though all of the same circuitry in Orion for Artemis 2 passed all the safety tests, they've decided to completely replace this electronic circuitry system just to be on the safe side. But once those circuits are replaced, there will need to be additional testing, which again pushes us back towards that September 2025 launch. So everything being done is being done for the safety of the astronauts that will be on board. It is just like, oh, another delay, but it's better to push it back to have a safe mission than to launch and have the possibility of a very dangerous mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So lots of very intriguing updates here. But what is this ultimately leading towards? Like like you said, Artemis 2 built upon Artemis 1, but now we want to be thinking ahead to the next step, which is landing those boots on the moon, right? Artemis 3.
Yeah, so to have a crewed flight to the moon, you need a crewed flight test, right? And that's what Artemis 2 is. Artemis 2 is the crewed flight test. Artemis 3 is going to be, the final thing. But any problems with Artemis 2 have to be fixed before Artemis 3. So any delays on Artemis 2 will mean delays to Artemis 3. The two are inherently tied together because one is a test of the main event, you know, if you want to think of it that way. So with all the delays of Artemis 2, it's kind of automatically Artemis 3 gets delayed because, you know, some of the components from Orion from Artemis 2 will be reused in Artemis 3. You have to make sure those are all working. But there are also other things that can delay Artemis 3 because it is a different mission.
Right.
And one of those things is the human landing system. So this is the part of the mission that the astronauts will go from the Orion capsule into this other spacecraft. That spacecraft will land them on the moon. The Orion spacecraft is not meant to be a lander. It's kind of just meant to be a shuttle between the two. And the system that NASA has decided upon is the Human Landing System Starship by SpaceX. They've contracted out to SpaceX to develop this. This has encountered numerous delays as well. Several flights tests still need to be completed before Artemis 3. So the idea for Artemis 3 is that the astronauts will launch on the SLS in the Orion capsule. The Orion capsule will dock with Starship at the moon. Starship will then land on the surface of the moon, then take off from the surface of the moon, redock with Orion, and Orion will bring the astronauts back home. So really landing on the moon, Starship is a fundamental part of being able to do that.
Yeah.
And they've completed 2 flight tests so far. Both have failed. SpaceX has said that they've succeeded. They're only partial failures, or they call them a success. They've failed. They didn't deliver any of the targets they wanted to. And they still have many, many more tests to do, because one really interesting part of this Starship is the in-space refueling, right? Specifically using cryogenic propellant. So cryogenic propellants are much more efficient than other propellants we use. But the current propellants we typically use are really stable at a variety of temperatures, right? So they'll work on Earth and they'll work in space. They're very helpful in that regard. Cryogenic propellants are more efficient, but they can't last for more than a few hours in space before they boil away. So the task now is that this is a very big ship. It requires quite a lot of fuel. It runs on cryogenic fuel. And so they have to figure out a in-space refueling method without it all boiling away or burning off. So this is one of the flight tests that needs to happen with the Starship system. But they still have to actually make it into space as well. This thing has gotten pretty high, but it still hasn't gotten into its leaving the atmosphere, re-entering the atmosphere, and landing. That's its original flight plan. It still has not been able to do that. The first one people might be most familiar with, that's when it destroyed its own launch pad. Like it was quite the largest.
But it was still partial successes, right?
Well, they deemed it a partial success because it cleared the launch pad and SpaceX didn't think it was going to which I say re-update your mission statement then, because their actual goal was to have the Starship enter a transatmospheric Earth orbit, so like just about the atmosphere, before re-entering the atmosphere and impacting the Pacific Ocean. The booster it's attached to, the actual like big rocket part, was supposed to make a controlled splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico, like how they're able to land themselves. Now that happened, they had to blow the whole thing up because it never separated. So if it wanted to be a true success, you should have said, we're just hoping it clears the launch pad, instead of saying that after you blew your own rocket up. Like that's
right.
Yeah. So it blew up. The second time, they also had to blow it up, but it was able to separate that time. So that was good. It still didn't land properly. The booster didn't land. The other thing also didn't. They had to blow it up as well. But they're getting closer, I guess. All this to say, though, is that this not working is going to push Artemis 3 back, even if Artemis 2 is a success. Even if Artemis 2 hits that September 2025 deadline, if this isn't ready, unless NASA has a backup plan, they will not land on the moon in 2026. The delays because of Starship, because it's such an instrumental part to what they're trying to do and trying to accomplish getting to the moon.
Yeah, this is so interesting. This is the first time that I've ever actually seen sort of some possibilities that this may not actually happen anytime soon, because it is so integrated with SpaceX, and because SpaceX has had so many successes, quote unquote successes, over the past few years, and because everything with that program in line with NASA has looked so positive. This is the first time that we may actually see some real kind of like pushback on things. But I suppose, when it comes to this particular mission, Artemis, like it's very high stakes, because this is, our first big sort of like global pushback to the moon. And you don't want any failure at this stage, just given all of the issues, that our planet has right now, and all of the, the rising costs of everything, any kind of like, I think, setback, and like an unexpected setback, actual failure of either Artemis 2 or 3, I think would be very detrimental to this whole program.
Yeah, it would not be. It's overrun its costs numerous times. Just the space launch system, like the rocket that NASA has developed. Not to mention, like, but on the other side, it's kind of like, if you're going to spend a lot of money on something, I would like it to be something to make sure people don't explode, right? Like, I would like that to be what you're spending money on. So
people dying is not a partial success.
It's not a partial success. That's a catastrophic failure, right? You don't want, them to die. And so everything being done, really, especially with Artemis 2, is to make sure that that does not happen, right? And it's much better to be safe and spend that money than to be sorry. The Starship problem is, like, there's other things at play with that, in terms of why using Starship, and could they contract out to a different company? They have already looked at or made a contract with Blue Origin to provide a human landing system for the future Artemis missions after Artemis 3. So looking at Artemis 4, 5, 6, etc., if those happen, to provide a landing system for that. But it's still, it's still touch and go. Mm-hmm. And really, at the end of the day, space travel's hard. Mm-hmm. It's not easy. And SpaceX had a lot of successes early on, especially getting to the ISS, but getting to the moon is different. It's a lot further. It's a lot more difficult. It takes a lot more. And especially now that they want to do this new leap in space cryogenic refueling, like, that's a whole other technological advancement. And so once you start doing that, you are going to see a lot of failures until you get a success. But it does, from a PR, I guess, perspective of, like, getting people excited in space, it's hard to be excited about a delay, right? Which sucks, but that's the nature of it. Things get delayed because you need to do them right.
Which is also part of, like, our job too. Like, our job here at the Space Center is also to get people excited about these upcoming missions. We've been talking about it all year. We've made a whole program plan, all set around, talking about all of these missions, these programs, and getting everyone excited. But that's par for the course, like you said. We've only got a few minutes left here, Marley, and I want to get through. We actually do have some questions about some of the stuff that you talked about, also some random questions as well. So Keith was talking about the heat shield. If we go back to when you were talking about the original heat shield, and he made an interesting comment how they hope that they understand survivorship bias when studying the unexpected burn areas in the heat shield. Are you familiar with that concept of survivorship bias?
Vaguely, but I don't think I could verbally explain it very well.
So I think what he's talking about is planes that came back in, like, World War II, I think. Right. This is what it is. So they would come back and they would have holes in them, and that's what they would be like, oh, we need to, like, patch up, like, these holes so, like, these planes can fly better. Right. When instead, what you were seeing was that planes that were returning with the holes, which meant that they were fine. Right. But the planes that crashed that were shot in other areas, those were sort of like the crucial ones. Those are the places
you want to fix.
That's what places you want to fix. I think that's what he's meaning there.
Yeah. So what they're doing in terms of, like, fixing the heat shield is they've done extensive modeling, and then they've been doing testing of the heat shield. Like, this, from the image I showed of it all scorched, the bottom. This is from the very first flight test in 2014. So there had been other flight tests after that. And so they have all of that data, and they have all of their modeling data. And basically what's happened is that it's burned in a way none of the models exactly expected. It was still within acceptable parameters, but kind of in the wrong spots and too close to the margin that they were comfortable with. And so that's why it rendered a second look. It's not so off their modeling that it would be a danger to anyone inside or it could lead to like mission failure. But because it doesn't match to the level they're comfortable with, they want to look into it, which I think is very fair, because extensive computer modeling and about 10 years worth of looking at different tests, and it comes back different, especially doing this new type of re-entry maneuver, would warrant, I think, another look and a re-look at it. So they're comparing like all the data they've modeled with what they actually got.
Right. Cecilia says 3,000 degrees. I thought 5,000 degrees.
It's 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 3,000 degrees Celsius.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
Those pesky Fahrenheit Celsius calculations.
Yeah. Well, it's because NASA press briefings are for they're an American, from the American government. So they'll release things in Fahrenheit. The scientists do still do things in Celsius.
I wonder if like people can do that. Can you do that calculation in your head? Just like
no, because it's a really annoying calculation. It's like the temperature in, I think, Fahrenheit to Celsius. I always get it backwards, but one of them, it's like the temperature in Celsius to get to Fahrenheit is the temperature in Celsius times 9/5 plus 32 point something. Like, it's a really annoying calculation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's -2 right now here. So which is, you know what that is in Fahrenheit?
No, like 10? I don't know.
28.4
yeah,
Fahrenheit.
See, it doesn't mean anything. I don't understand Fahrenheit. I know it's about like what the body temperature feels like, but I don't get it.
I know it doesn't make any sense, because what is that? 28 doesn't mean anything. -2 means that it's
water
freezing.
will freeze. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
A couple of interesting comments here, unrelated. So Vosky asks, because he's looking for a full image of the Antarctic continent that is not composite or non-mosaic. He's been looking on sun-synchronous satellites orbiting Earth. Is that possible? Are some of those Earth observing satellites?
You have to get pretty far. So when you go over the poles and like sun synchronous, if you're just in one spot, but the Earth rotates, but I guess if you're sun synchronous, you're kind of in the same spot. But you have to get far away. Like satellites, I think they're just too close to get a non-mosaic image. You'd have to be leaving at a weird direction, like from the bottom. Like, I don't know if they can easily get one. I think you have to be a bit further out than our satellite orbits that take images
thought about that before.
Yeah.
He also says, do you know about the deathbed confession of Stanley Kubrick and how he directed the Apollo 11 mission?
I don't, but I love that you think that, like, my favorite rebuttal to anything regarding like, oh, the moon landing was fake is that's the conspiracy. The conspiracy is that it's fake. You know, like that's very fun. Or that you believe in the moon.
Yeah,
that's always a good.
Well, I mean, like the 2001 Space Odyssey, which is actually my favorite movie of all time. What was really interesting is that these special effects supervisors on that movie, what they did, they actually destroyed all of the models afterwards, because they knew that what they were doing was going to be copied. So they didn't want anyone to like copy what they were doing, which is why the special effects in that movie look so good for the time. Because any of the other movies that came afterwards that tried to like copy them weren't able to like replicate, you know, the actual models. Like when spaceships are flying through space, it actually feels, you know, kind of like now what we think of as spaceships flying through space, which is very slow and methodical and just kind of like moving towards, you know, the moon, or in the case of Space Odyssey at the space station. It's very
Why
cool
did they
stuff.
destroy it?
They you know, it's not like a collaboration, you know, like we think of today. They just didn't want anyone to copy them. So
wow, okay.
What's funny about Cecilia's comment from before is that it came from her son Theo, who's 8 years old. So
oh, thank you, Theo.
There you go.
Yes, no, so yeah, different units, 5,000 Fahrenheit, 3,000 Celsius. Yeah.
And one last question back from Vosky. There seems to be an invisible circle that all the satellites never go over. Do you know about an invisible circle that satellites don't go over? Like a certain area of the Earth,
not
maybe?
That I know of. No, I don't know. Like, so there's like different orbital heights you'll go to depending on what you want to do and what works. And so there's like, you kind of think of it as like bands of satellites. Like the further out you go, you'll get like another band of them. And then there's ones that orbit like north to south, and there's
Yeah.
ones that orbit around equatorial, like east to west. But I don't know of any places where they just don't go. They just kind of go in different directions.
Okay. Something to perhaps look into. We actually
Yeah.
are going to be doing a little mini presentation for Earth Day this year that we're talking about some of the Earth observing satellites on April the 20th. That will be a joint program actually with the Maritime Museum and with the Museum of Vancouver. Lots of fun and exciting events happening here at the Space Center. Of course, our next big event is going to be Valentine's night, which is going to be super fun. We're doing a cosmic listening room up here in the planetarium. We're going to be playing all our favorite songs, David Bowie, Taylor Swift, Rihanna, I think is on the playlist. And Marley, you're going to be talking with a journalist that lives in the Northwest Territories, all about photographing the Aurora Borealis. So that's going to be really fun. That's a 19+ event, but we've got food catering coming in, beer and wine for sale. So lots of cool stuff coming. Plus, lots of we got some family events coming up as well. Family Day in February. Go to our website, spacecenter.ca, to check out all of our programs. And you can join us here on whatever device you're watching. First time on Instagram. Hello to all the Instagram viewers. We're going to be back here live in 2 weeks. That's going to be January 25th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. We'll see you all then.